Midnight at the Gilded Lotus, the most exclusive resort in the city. Lori T. People didn't see the gold leaf ceilings or the $5,000 chandeliers. She only saw the smudge on the marble she'd been scrubbing for 14 hours. Her back was a knot of fire, her natural curls escaping her maid's cap, and the scent of industrial bleach was etched into her skin. She was a ghost in a world of giants, just trying to survive the night shift. She didn't notice the man in the corner lounge. Han Joon-Seok sat in the shadows, his black silk shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the tiger's eyes tattooed on his neck. He was a man whose name was whispered in fear across the underworld, a monster with cold eyes that had seen 1,000 betrayals. But as he watched Lori, he didn't see a maid. He saw a dignity that his world of blood had long ago forgotten. Then, the heavy oak doors flew open. Han Min-Jae, the ice princess, heiress, and Joon-Seok's bitter ex, marched in, her designer heels clicking like a countdown. She saw Joon-Seok, and then she saw Lori, the woman standing in the space she used to own. "Get this trash out of my sight." Min-Jae's scream shattered the silence. "She's contaminating the air. Guards, drag this woman out of here. Now." As two massive guards lunged for Lori's arms, she shrank back, her hand hovering near Joon-Seok's sleeve in a silent plea. Lori expected a beating. She expected to be thrown into the street. She didn't expect the sound that would change her life. One snap of Joon-Seok's fingers. For 0.2 seconds of surgical, justified violence. And a revelation about a family debt that would leave an heiress begging for mercy on the floor she just called trash. Before we go any further, pause for just 1 second. If you love powerful stories, forbidden choices, and single moments that change lives forever, like this video and subscribe to K-Empire Stories, because from here on, the stories only get darker, deeper, and far more intense. And share this video, because someone out there needs to hear this story. Now tell me, asterisk, where are you watching from right now? Asterisk. Drop your city or country in the comments. The Gilded Lotus didn't just demand service, it demanded invisibility. For Lori T. People, the job was a daily exercise in becoming a shadow. As she moved through the sprawling, gold-veined corridors of the private lounge, she practiced the art of the silent step, her soft-soled shoes barely making a whisper against the cold marble. To the guests who paid 5 figures a night to sleep beneath these ceilings, Lori wasn't a person with a name or a history. She was merely a moving part of the architecture, a silent ghost meant to erase the evidence of their excess. Her uniform was a stiff, polyester cage that chafed against her skin, a stark contrast to the silk and cashmere that draped the bodies of those she served. She tucked a stray lock of her natural curls back under the tight rim of her maid's cap, a constant battle she was losing as the humidity of the cleaning steam made the dark coils rebel. Those curls were a piece of her grandmother's spirit, the only thing she carried into this sterile world that felt authentic. But here, they were just something to be hidden, a distraction from the seamless luxury the resort promised. Lori's hands, cracked and dry from the constant bite of industrial bleach, moved with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace. She polished the crystal decanters until they caught the amber light of the chandeliers, her reflection appearing for a split second in the glass. A tired, brown face with eyes that had seen too many double shifts and not enough dreams. She felt the heavy weight of her 14th hour pressing down on her shoulders, a physical ache that hummed in sync with the low buzz of the air conditioning. In this room, surrounded by wealth that could feed her neighborhood for a decade, Lori felt the crushing reality of being less than. She was the person who moved the heavy furniture, who scrubbed the wine stains from the rugs, and who disappeared into the service elevator the moment a door opened. She had learned to keep her gaze fixed on the floor, to read the world through the shoes of the powerful, polished Oxfords, red-bottomed heels, and Italian loafers. She believed that if she stayed quiet enough, if she worked hard enough, she could eventually buy her way out of the shadows. She didn't realize that in the corner of that very room, someone was finally looking at the ghost, and for the first time in years, someone actually saw the woman beneath the cap. The stillness of the lounge shifted before the door even moved. It was a change in the air pressure, a sudden, heavy gravity that made the fine hairs on Lori's arms stand up. Then he walked in. Han Joon-Seok didn't enter a room so much as he reclaimed it. He moved with a predatory grace, his black shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the edge of a jagged ink line, the stripes of a tiger that seemed to breathe with every step he took. He didn't look at the opulence around him. He didn't have to. The Gilded Lotus was just another box of glass and stone, and he was the force that could shatter it. Lori froze, her cloth poised over a mahogany side table. She kept her head bowed, as she had been trained, but she could feel the heat radiating from his presence as he passed. He didn't head for the center of the room. Instead, he chose a seat in the deep shadows of the corner, moving with a terrifyingly calm dominance. Every click of his lighter, every slow exhale of smoke, felt like a command. He was the kind of man whose silence was louder than a shout, a figure of lethal authority who carried the scent of expensive tobacco and old, cold rain. From the corner of her eye, Lori saw the tattoos on his neck, a dragon coiled in perpetual combat with a tiger, disappearing into the dark silk of his shirt. He looked like a man who had built a throne out of the bones of his enemies. Yet there was something in the way he sat, perfectly still, perfectly watchful, that felt different from the usual arrogance of the resort's clientele. He wasn't looking for a drink or a distraction. His eyes, dark and unreadable, were fixed on her. Lori felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck. Usually, guests looked through her, their eyes sliding over her as if she were a piece of furniture. But Joon-Seok's gaze was a physical weight, checking the exhaustion in her posture and the way her fingers trembled as she worked. It wasn't the gaze of a customer, it was the gaze of a judge. In that silent lounge, under the golden glow of the chandeliers, a dangerous bridge was being built between the most powerful man in the city and the woman the world had forgotten. He sat in the darkness, a beast in a tailored suit, watching the invisible girl as if she were the only thing in the room that actually mattered. The heavy, respectful silence of the lounge didn't just break, it was incinerated. The double doors swung wide, hitting the stoppers with a violent thud that echoed against the marble. Han Min-Jae didn't walk into the room, she invaded it. She was a whirlwind of sharp edges and expensive vanity, draped in a cream-colored designer coat that flowed behind her like a battle cape. Before she even spoke, the air was conquered by her perfume, a cloying, aggressive scent of jasmine and metallic lilies that choked out the neutral aroma of the room's expensive candles. It was a toxic fragrance, the kind that announced her arrival 5 minutes before she appeared and lingered like a threat long after she left. Lori's heart skipped a beat, her instincts screaming at her to shrink even further into the shadows. She focused on the grain of the wood she was polishing, her breath hitching as Min-Jae's high heels clicked toward the center of the room like a firing squad's drumbeat. Min-Jae's eyes, hidden behind oversized dark lenses, scanned the room until they landed on the shadow in the corner, Han Joon-Seok. The sight of him, sitting in calm, unreachable silence, seemed to pull a trigger inside her. She was a woman who had spent 3 weeks sending messages that went unread and making calls that never connected, and the sight of his indifference was a spark to a gasoline-soaked ego. But she didn't direct her rage at him, not yet. She needed a victim, a soft target to prove she still held the scepter of power in this kingdom. Her gaze drifted, sharp and predatory, until it snagged on Lori. For a split second, Min-Jae saw what Joon-Seok had been looking at, the quiet dignity, the natural curls, the brown skin that looked like velvet under the warm lights. It was a beauty that didn't cost $300 an hour to maintain, and to Min-Jae, that was the ultimate insult. What is this? Min-Jae's voice cut through the air, high and brittle, vibrating with a manufactured disgust. She pointed a manicured finger, tipped with blood-red polish, directly at Lori's chest. Is this the standard of the Gilded Lotus now? Leaving the help out in the open like common dust? She marched toward Lori, her face contorting into a mask of pure, venomous jealousy. She wasn't just angry at her ex-boyfriend. She was projecting every ounce of her rejection onto the woman she deemed disposable. To Min-Jae, Lori wasn't a worker. She was a convenient scapegoat, a way to reclaim the attention of the man in the shadows by destroying the only other living soul in the room. The air in the lounge grew thin, suffocated by Min-Jae's escalating hysteria. She stood inches from Lori, her presence a jagged blade of entitlement. I asked you a question, girl, Min-Jae hissed, her voice dropping to a register of casual cruelty that made the blood in Lori's veins turn to ice. Do you not have a tongue, or are you just as slow as you look? Lori took a reflexive step back, her fingers clutching the damp cleaning cloth like a shield. I'm just finishing my shift, ma'am. I'll be gone in a moment, she whispered, her voice trembling but holding a thread of the dignity that had so infuriated the heiress. A moment? You shouldn't have been allowed in here to begin with, Min-Jae snapped, turning her head to signal the two massive guards who stood like statues by the door. She didn't look at them. She looked past them, her eyes darting toward the shadows where Joon-Seok sat, desperate to see if her cruelty was finally drawing his focus. Look at her. This maid is contaminating the atmosphere of a private lounge. I can practically smell the street on her. The racism wasn't a shout. It was an undertone, a vibration of dehumanization that suggested Lori was a biological error in a room meant for purity. Min-Jae's face twisted as she realized Joon-Seok still hadn't moved. The lack of reaction drove her over the edge. What are you standing there for? She shrieked at her guards, her fingers shaking as she pointed at Lori. I don't want her walking out. I want her dragged out. Throw her into the service alley where she belongs. Now, the guards, Marcus and Kyle, shared a brief, panicked glance. They were used to Min-Jae's tantrums, the thrown lattes and the shredded designer bags, but this was different. They saw the Gilded Lotus logo on Lori's uniform. They saw the exhaustion in her eyes. They knew that dragging a staff member out of a resort owned by the underworld's elite was a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They hesitated, their heavy boots shifting uncertainly on the marble. Did I stutter? Min-Jae screamed, her voice breaking with narcissistic rage. I pay your salaries. Move. Seeing the massive men finally take a reluctant step forward, Lori felt the world tilt. She retreated until her back hit the edge of a mahogany table, her hand hovering near the shadow where Joon-Seok sat. She looked at the guards, then at the screaming woman, feeling the familiar, crushing weight of being small in a world of giants. She braced herself for the grip of rough hands on her arms, for the humiliation of the floor against her face. She closed her eyes, waiting for the impact of a world that had finally decided she was no longer allowed to be invisible. The guards' shadows lengthened across the marble as they closed the distance, their hands outstretched like iron talons ready to seize Lori's thin frame. She felt the cold sweat of terror on her neck, her breath hitching as the lead guard's fingers brushed the fabric of her sleeve. But the air didn't explode with a scream. It exploded with a sound that was far more lethal. Snap! The sound of Han Joon-Seok's fingers was sharp, resonant, and carried the weight of a death sentence. It was a signal that sliced through Min-Jae's shrill shouting like a razor through silk. Before the sound could even fade from the acoustic panels of the ceiling, the shadows behind Joon-Seok's chair detached themselves from the darkness. What followed was not a brawl. It was a 4.2-second masterpiece of surgical violence. The first guard, Marcus, didn't even have time to blink before a blur of black fabric intersected his path. A strike, precise and devastating, found the nerve cluster behind his ear. His eyes rolled back instantly, his massive body becoming dead weight before his knees even hit the floor. His partner, Kyle, reached for a concealed holster, but he was already too late. A second shadow moved with a fluidity that made the resort's professional security look like amateurs in slow motion. A palm strike to the sternum drove the air from Kyle's lungs with a sickening oomph, followed by a sweeping kick that sent him crashing through a glass-topped display table. The shards of expensive crystal rained down like diamonds, but the noise of the breaking glass was nothing compared to the silence that followed. Lori stood frozen, her eyes wide as she looked down at the two men who, seconds ago, had been a physical threat to her existence. They were neutralized, pinned to the floor by Joon-Seok's elite operators, who now stood over them with the cold, detached expressions of machines. Not a single drop of blood had touched Lori's uniform. Not a single hair on her head had been disturbed. The elite guards didn't look at the chaos they had created, they looked only at Joon-Seok. He finally stood, moving out of the shadows and into the amber glow of the chandelier. The dragon on his neck seemed to shimmer in the light, its ink-dark scales appearing to pulse with the sudden rush of adrenaline in the room. He didn't look at his ex-girlfriend, whose face had frozen in a mask of comical shock. He looked at Lori's trembling hand, which was still hovering near the place he had just occupied. The predator had stepped out of the dark, not to hunt the maid, but to prove that in his presence, she was the only one who was truly untouchable. Han Joon-Seok stepped over the unconscious guard with a terrifying indifference, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble. The room, which had been filled with Min-Jae's high-pitched vitriol, was now so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Min-Jae stood paralyzed, her hand still raised in the air, that single, manicured finger still pointing at the space where she had expected Lori to be broken. Joon-Seok didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stopped just inches from her, his presence a cold front that seemed to sap the warmth from her expensive coat. He reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and wrapped his hand around her pointing wrist. His grip wasn't a caress, it was a shackle. He didn't squeeze, but the absolute stillness of his strength made Min-Jae's breath hitch in her throat. "This finger," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that made the crystal shards on the floor tremble. He tilted his head, looking at her red-tipped nail as if examining a piece of filth. "You used it to point at a woman who has worked more in a single night than you have in your entire, pampered life. You used it to order a violence you aren't strong enough to witness." Min-Jae tried to pull away, a flicker of her old defiance sparking in her eyes, but it died the moment she looked into his. "Joon-Seok, you're overreacting. She's just a maid. My father." "Your father?" Joon-Seok interrupted, his voice turning into a jagged edge of ice. "Is the reason you think you're protected. You think that name is a shield. You think it gives you the right to treat people like debris." He leaned in closer, until his lips were inches from her ear, though his eyes remained fixed on her trembling hand. "But shields can be shattered, Min-Jae, and names can be erased. When you pointed that finger at her, you pointed it at me. You signaled an attack on the only person in this room with an ounce of real value." He slowly began to push her hand down, forcing her arm to drop until her finger was pointing at the floor, at the blood of her own guards. The realization finally hit her, the crushing weight of the snap. She wasn't the Empress anymore. She was a trespasser in a kingdom that had just revoked her citizenship. Joon-Seok let go of her wrist with a flick of his fingers, as if discarding something contaminated, leaving her to stumble back. She looked at her hand as if it no longer belonged to her, the red polish now looking less like a fashion statement and more like a mark of shame. She was no longer protected. She was merely a target waiting for the final blow. The silence in the lounge was no longer empty. It was heavy with the scent of an ending. Min-Jae clutched her designer bag against her chest like a shield, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. She looked around the room, searching for a spark of the loyalty she thought her father's name guaranteed, but she found only the cold, unblinking lenses of 10 different smartphones, held aloft by witnesses recording her descent. "My father will have your head for this," she hissed, the threat sounding hollow even to her own ears. "The Chase Group owns this district. We own the banks. We own. You own nothing." Joon-Seok cut her off, his voice as calm as a winter morning. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a single, charcoal gray envelope. He didn't hand it to her. He simply let it drop onto the table she had been leaning against, the heavy paper thudding with finality. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, your father's primary creditors sold their distressed assets. The Chase Group's high-interest bonds, the offshore liens on your family's estate, and the deeds to your properties in Seoul, they all moved into the hands of a single holding company." Min-Jae's eyes darted to the envelope, her face draining of color until she looked as pale as the marble floor. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the $4.2 million in debt your father leveraged to keep your influencer lifestyle afloat," Joon-Seok said, stepping closer until his shadow completely swallowed hers. "The holding company is mine, Min-Jae. I didn't just buy your debt. I bought your future. The car waiting for you outside. It's mine. The penthouse you're sleeping in? Mine. Even the coat on your back was purchased with credit that I now control." The princess of the Gilded Lotus seemed to physically shrink, her shoulders curling inward as the realization settled in like a poison. In 30 seconds of quiet dialogue, the golden thread that connected her to her status had been severed. She wasn't just losing her ex-boyfriend. She was losing the very ground she stood on. You're joking," she whispered, her voice finally breaking into a sob of pure, narcissistic terror. "I don't joke about investments," Joon-Seok replied, his eyes moving past her to Lori, who was watching the scene with a mixture of shock and a dawning sense of justice. "And I certainly don't invest in trash that doesn't know its place. You came here to drag someone out, Min-Jae. But it seems you're the only one here who no longer has a room." The power had shifted so completely that the air itself felt different. The woman who had entered as an empress was now standing in a pile of her own shattered pride. A peasant in designer clothing realized that the man she had tried to manipulate had been the only thing keeping her world from collapsing. The air in the lounge turned frigid, a vacuum where Min-Jae's social oxygen used to be. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and searching, but the elite crowd she once called her peers had transformed into a wall of glass and silicon. Everywhere she turned, she met the unblinking, black lenses of high-end smartphones. The very people she had performed for on social media were now capturing the ultimate content, her total annihilation. There was no sympathy in their eyes, only the predatory hunger of the digital age, waiting to upload the fall of the Ice Princess. "Get out," Joon-Seok said, the command so quiet it was terrifying. It wasn't shouted, it was a fact. Min-Jae tried to muster one last shred of her former arrogance. She pulled her coat tighter, her fingers trembling against the expensive wool, but as she took a step toward the door, she stumbled. Her heel caught on a shard of the crystal her own guard had shattered, a jagged reminder of the violence she had invited into the room. A soft ripple of laughter, cruel and cold, erupted from a nearby table. It was the sound of a social circle closing its ranks against a pariah. She had to walk the length of the long, marble hall, a gauntlet of judgment that felt a mile long. With every step, the flashbulbs of recording phones flickered like lightning, documenting the smear of mascara on her cheeks and the way her lower lip wouldn't stop shaking. She was a woman who lived by the image, and now, that image was being burned in real time. The toxic perfume she wore seemed to sour in the heat of her shame, trailing behind her like the scent of something dying. As she reached the heavy oak doors, the same doors she had burst through with such theatrical violence only minutes ago, she turned back one last time. She expected to see Joon-Seok watching her with triumph, but his back was already turned. He was focused entirely on Lori, dismissing Min-Jae's entire existence as if she were a finished cigarette flicked into the gutter. The doors didn't hit the stoppers this time. They swung shut with a muffled, expensive thud, locking her out of the world of gold and light, leaving her to face the cold service alley of her new reality. The Empress was gone, and in her place was a viral ghost, haunting the internet with the memory of the night she lost everything. The silence that followed the slamming of the doors was heavy, but it was no longer suffocating. It was a clean silence, the kind that follows a storm. Lori remained by the mahogany table, her fingers still curled around the damp cleaning cloth, her heart settling into a slow, rhythmic thud. She felt exposed in the sudden stillness, acutely aware of her stained uniform and the messy bun of her natural curls. She started to turn away, to retreat back into the invisibility she had used as armor for so long, but a voice stopped her. "Don't," Joon-Seok said. It wasn't a command this time. It was an invitation. He stepped toward her, and for the first time, the predatory coldness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a weary, ancient understanding. He looked at her grandmother's necklace, then at the calluses on her hands, and he didn't see a maid. He saw a survivor. "The world thinks the most dangerous people are the ones with tattoos and shadows," he said softly, his voice for her ears only. "But I have spent my life learning that the real monsters are the ones who smile while they try to erase you." Lori looked up, meeting his dark gaze. "Why did you do it?" she whispered, her voice finally steady. "You don't even know me. To everyone else here, I'm just part of the furniture." Joon-Seok reached up, tracing the jagged scar on his eyebrow. 10 years ago, my sister wore a uniform like yours. She worked until her hands bled, believing that if she stayed quiet, the world would be kind. It wasn't. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her not as a threat, but as a canopy. "I cannot change the past, Lori. But I can ensure that in this city, no one ever looks at you and sees trash again." He reached into his pocket and produced a small, silver pin, a tiger's head, its eyes made of tiny, burning rubies. It was the mark of his inner circle, the shield of the tiger. He didn't pin it on her. He held it out, letting her choose. You carry a dragon's heart in your chest, even if the world tried to make you forget it. Take this. You will never have to be invisible again. You won't just work here. You will be the one who decides who is allowed to stay. As Lori reached out and took the silver mark, the weight of the last 14 hours and the last 10 years seemed to lift. When their hands touched, a silent pact was sealed. She wasn't just a maid anymore, and he wasn't just a monster. Under the amber glow of the Gilded Lotus, the invisible girl had finally been found, and the man who owned the shadows had finally found something worth protecting. If you enjoy intense stories filled with twists, danger, and moments that make you question everything, subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support. Until the next story, stay sharp.